My name is Dustin Neely. I'm the lead pastor here, and it's my privilege to teach the Word of God, which comes to us in the Holy Scriptures almost every week here. And we typically do a type of teaching here called expositional teaching, where we just open a book of the Bible and we just teach through it paragraph by paragraph. But a few times a year, we'll kind of hit the pause button on that method. We will go in a different direction and look at several topics. We've preached through books like 1 Peter and Philippians and Song of Songs. And we've looked at topics like prayer and family. And today, we begin a brand new series concerning money. And if you're here for the first time and you haven't been in church in a long time, you're saying to yourself, man, I knew it. It's been 10 years since I've been here. I should have known that one day I come back and give it a shot. The preacher's going to talk about money. Well, let me just let you know up front, there's no guilt trip today. There's not going to be any, plea for financial giving that's going to be long and drawn out against you today. In fact, if you're here for the first time, we don't encourage you to give at all. We just hope the service is a gift to you, so you don't have to sweat it. But the thing about money is that money matters. It matters to God, and it matters to us. In the Scriptures, if you look about money, you'll actually see that over 2,300 verses speak specifically about money. When you think about Jesus and the way he taught through parables and stories most often, more than 2/3 of those deal specifically with money. So if we see how much money matters to God, and we know how much money matters to us, then we wouldn't be interacting well with God and the world if we didn't set aside some time to study money, because it matters. When I was reflecting on that this week, I came across a story in my memory of something that happened to me in kindergarten. You guys who are here every week, I love to tell stories about being from a small town. Well, at every kindergarten, we had show and tell. Any show and tell victims here, or show and tell participants, depending on how it went? All right, well, there was this one kid named Michael. And Michael had a family that would take him to the big city of Knoxville, all right? And so he would go to this mecca of toys called Toys R Us that we didn't have access to in Big Stone Gap. And every time he'd take one of these trips, he'd come back with something that none of us had ever seen. I remember he had toys from Raiders of the Lost Ark, and one day he had a toy from Godzilla. And I remember, and I just need to confess this to you, I lusted in my heart after the 3-foot-tall plastic Godzilla. I coveted his toy because it had this lever on the back of its head that if you pull it down, this plastic fire came out. And it was just amazing. It literally changed my life. Well, the problem was Michael wasn't really into sharing, and he didn't want to let me or anybody else play with that toy. And I just went on and I implored him, Michael, you got to let me play with Godzilla. No. Well, finally I worked it out where I actually told on him to the teacher and then to his mother, and I got to play with it, so don't go do it likewise. That's kind of mean. But later in life, I learned something about Michael and about money. That when someone owns something, they get to decide what happens with it. That since Michael owned the plastic Godzilla with the awesome, amazing fire, he got to decide who played with it and what happened with it. But you know what's interesting? When we think about money, we don't often think of it in those terms, do we? Because we look at money, we look at what God has given us, and we think that we own it. But if you look at the totality of the Scriptures and you boil down kind of the big thought of what the Bible has to say about money, it's this. It's that God owns everything, and we are simply His stewards. That's what we're going to be talking about today. Let's say that together. God owns everything, and we are simply His stewards. Now let's unpack this idea here a little bit of God owns everything. I think you see it in a couple of different texts. The first one, 1 Chronicles 29, verses 11 and 12, which say, Yours, O Lord, is the greatness, and the power, and the glory, and the victory, and the majesty, for all that is in the heavens and in the earth is yours. Yours is the kingdom, O Lord, and you are exalted as head above all. Both riches and honor come from you, and you rule over all. You see it again in Haggai chapter 2, verse 8. The silver is mine and the gold is mine, declares the Lord of hosts. And perhaps you're familiar with this verse from Psalm 24:1. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein. So what we're going to be working from is kind of a foundational truth today, is since God owns everything, He should get to decide what happens with it. And so we need to move from this place of ownership into a place of stewardship. If you're here and you've been around the community of faith and you're kind of acquainted with the teachings of the Bible, there's probably something within you that says, yeah, that's right. I do need to be a better steward. But where the rubber really meets the road in our lives is how do we do that? And I think that there's at least three things that Jesus is going to teach us today in a parable from Luke chapter 16, that if you don't know these, and more importantly, if you don't walk in them, you cannot be the kind of steward that Jesus wants you to be. Now, as you turn into Luke 16, or you look in your notes, let me make just a couple of comments about parables, because parables are a notoriously difficult form of literature to interpret. Now, we've probably all heard teaching at some point on parables, and people do some crazy things with parables. But this is my take on how they're to be best interpreted. That when Jesus taught them, there was typically one point that he was trying to make. There was one moral judgment that he was trying to get his audience to come to. There was one conclusion, one thought that he was trying to reinforce. So if we're going to rightly handle these parables, we need to start with that one major point, and then if we draw any secondary points, we need to keep them second and see that they flesh out the main idea of what Jesus is trying to say. And that is what I think we have exactly in our text today. If you look in your notes, you'll see that it's 13 verses. And I think the way that this breaks out is the first 8 verses are a story that give you a major point. And then the following verses give you several other points of what Jesus wants you to understand so that you can do what he tells you to do in the first 8 verses. Let's go ahead and dig right in here in verses 1 and 2. Jesus is teaching his disciples, and he says to them, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. And he called to him and said, 'What is this I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be my manager.'" So what was probably happening here in this historical context is a wealthy man had hired another man to come in as a steward or a manager to manage his affairs, to pay his bills, to see that his business was run properly. But what seems to be happening here between the lines is this man, maybe he's at the temple gate, maybe he's somewhere else, and he begins to hear some chatter in the system that the man who he's put in charge of his money is squandering all of his wealth. And so he goes to this dishonest manager and he calls him out. And he says, "Look, this is the 11th hour for your job. Your little Enron experiment here is not working for me. You're done." And then in verse 3, you see his response. "And the manager said to himself, 'What shall I do since my master is taking the management away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I am too ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do, so that when I'm removed from management, people may receive me into their houses.'" You know, if this was a cartoon, there would be one of those light bulbs right above this guy's head right now. He has come up with a plan of how he's going to take his little bit of time and a little bit of opportunity to ensure for himself a secure future. Look what he does in verse 5. "So summoning the master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He said, 100 measures of oil. He said to him, 'Take your bill and sit down quickly and write it 50. So immediately he cuts this man's debt in half. Then he said to another, 'How much do you owe?' 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, 'Take your bill and write 80. 20% discount for the second guy. And then look at what happens in verse 8. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. Now we look at that and we're like, what? How can this man who hired this guy, who was totally giving him the shaft financially, how could he commend what he was doing? Well, I think it's because he was a good businessman. And he saw this man who had definitely outwitted him, and he couldn't help but say, you know, you got me. I commend you for what you've done in your shrewdness. And then I think Jesus begins to explain this parable for us in verse 9. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. So what Jesus is saying here to them and to us today is that these people who live in the city of man, who are consumed with the world and its ways and its toys, they know more about how to leverage wealth for a way that is effective than the people who live in the city of God, who should know better than anybody what money can do for the expansion and the building of the kingdom. And it's almost like Jesus is saying to them, hey, I'm not commending this man who did a dishonest thing, but look at how he used this money. He took a little bit of time and a little bit of opportunity, and he put it to work. And so Jesus then, I think, begins to teach us these three things, that if we want to move from a place of ownership to a place of stewardship, under the umbrella that God owns everything, that we've got to know about money. And the first thing is that money is a tool. Look here at verse 9. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into heavenly dwellings or eternal dwellings. What you have here in this verse is basically two things. First, it's a command, and second, it's an explanation of why that command is there. The first command is, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth. And there's a lot of debate on what these verses mean, but I'll tell you where I come out with it. What he's saying here is that you need to use and leverage your money in such a way that it is a tool that even though you can't take your money with you when you die, you need to send it on ahead by making friends for yourselves through giving and gospel expansion that will greet you when you come into heaven. And you see that explanation there. So that when it fails, so Jesus is reminding them, hey, this money is temporary. It's not eternal. But one day you're going to move into a place of eternal dwellings. And so Jesus is saying your money is a tool that will make sure that you have somewhat of a welcoming party in heaven. Now there's also some debate here. Is this talking about God, or is this talking about specific people that will welcome us? I think to me the point is actually the same. That we use our wealth as a tool so that we will be welcomed into heaven. So what's the application that's most clear for us today? Well, I think the first one is very simple. That we need to give in accordance with what the Scriptures say about giving. Now, I can't say everything I want to say about this today, but I preached 2 messages last year that will be re-released this week on the podcast that go into great detail in explaining everything I'm about to say about giving. If you want to get those, they'll be out there. Just download them for free this week. But here's what the Scripture says about how we should give. We should give gifts that are motivated by the gospel or grace and not guilt. They should be from our hearts in proportion with our income. They should be regular or systematic in nature. They should be cheerful, generous, and be given in faith. And I believe that the tithe is a great place to start. This 10%, I don't see it mandated hardcore in the New Testament. But I do think that it's a great place to start. And so when we think about money, we need to see it as a tool. You know, the best example I ever saw of this principle was when I served a church down in Tennessee. There was a man there who was quite young. He had just turned 40. But by the time he was in his late 20s, till the time he was 40, he had started a company in the cell phone tower business. He got right in, right when it was getting started, and he raised that company up, and before he was 40, he sold that company for $30 million, and he retired. But instead of just kind of sitting around and wasting the rest of his life and playing golf all the time, he actually began to use that money as a tool. So much so that his own private plane that his company owned, he would use and take to put church members on it and fly them to Mexico every year at his own expense to be able to let them serve the poor in Mexico. Same guy, his church went to build a building so they could reach out to their community, put up half the money himself because he understood that money is a tool. He understood that he wanted to make friends for himself with his wealth that was going to fail so that there would be people welcoming him to eternal dwellings. So the questions we need to ask ourselves here are quite simple. Are we using the money that God has given us as a tool? And if not, how can we take a step in the right direction? And for a lot of us here, we listen and we go, you know what? I'm way past 40. I don't even have $1 million. In fact, I don't even have $100,000. In fact, sometimes I wonder if I'm even going to be able to pay my bills. That can't apply to me. No? Listen on to what we see here. It's not about how much you have. It's about what you do with what you have. So the question is, are you using your money as a tool? Look here at the next verse. Verse 10, you see this. That money is not only a tool, but it's also a test. One who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much. And one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. If you have then not been faithful in unrighteous wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? And so I think Jesus lays out for us another principle here that is true not only with money, but it's also true in other areas of life as well. And that's that faithfulness with a little leads to greater responsibility. Now here in this text, I think you see this both in earthly and also eternal perspective. Because what Jesus is clearly saying here is, if you take care of a little, then someone could and very likely will give you more. But if you're not faithful with the little you have, why would you expect to be entrusted with more? And then in the internal sense there in verse 11, if you've not been faithful with this unrighteous or temporary worldly wealth, who will give you true eternal riches? See also responsibility in heaven. So I think the application that we need to draw here for ourselves is that we need to be faithful with the little we have. And that starts with our money, and then I think it expands to other areas of life as well. Think about it in regard to work. If you've ever been there when somebody was just brand new and hired on, do you know any manager that just puts a brand newbie in place in leadership? Not unless that manager wants to have their last day at work as well. Because what they're looking for there, unless they've got a ringer resume or somebody that knows the field inside and out, is they're looking for faithfulness with a little so that they might be given more. The same is true in regard to our parenting. I was talking with one of the families in the church this week that has an older child, 7 years old, and they're about to give them their first checking account. And what's so beautiful about this is they want to teach this child faithfulness when he's little with the little, so that as he grows and he takes on more responsibility, he's going to be able to handle it. This week, I'm going to do some video blogging of things that you can do as parents to be able to begin to teach your children stewardship, wisdom, money as a tool, and money as a test. Because if we get this right, it's going to lead to life and greater meaning in our own lives. But if we get this wrong, it's going to lead to great dysfunction both now in this life and also in the life to come. So the question I think we need to ask ourselves here is pretty simple. Are we being faithful with what we have, and do we understand that money is a test, both on a temporal and in an eternal sense? The answer to that question is yes or no. The follow-up question remains the same. What do you need to do to take the next step in the direction of operating out of a place that money is a test? You know, and some people believe that here in verse 13 that this might actually be kind of the whole point of Jesus' teaching. That money is not just a tool, that money is not just a test, but that money is a trademark. That it truly says something about where we are in our orientation to God. You know, some of us hear this and we go, oh, that can't be right. Because surely what shows where we're at with God is how much we read the Bible, or how much we go to Sunday gathering or community group, or how much we serve the poor. Well, you know what's interesting? Jesus said something in Matthew chapter 6, verse 21, that where your treasure is, your heart will be also. So this idea here of the trademark, we cannot dismiss just because we don't like it. Because look what Jesus says here in verse 13. No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. Underline that word cannot. You cannot serve God and money. So what Jesus is saying here is if you want to see where your heart's at, you need to follow the money. Don't just talk about devotion in the externals, but follow the money. You know, the idea of the trademark here, probably the best way I've ever seen this illustrated was, again, back to my youth. Anybody here remember the Cabbage Patch Kids? All right? Remember those little dolls? There was all this thing. This was before the Furby and before the Xbox and all the other Christmas idols, toys. But basically, these were these toys and everybody was consumed with, and they had to have. Well, the thing that I found most interesting about these guys is that on their bottom, they had a little signature. And I just need to let you know, I never owned one of these, so this is from, like, by proxy experience. That's the honest truth. You shouldn't follow me if I owned a Cabbage Patch doll. Just kidding. But there was something written on their bottom, and it was the name of the man who came up with these, Xavier Roberts. Now, first of all, I always thought it was kind of creepy that he signed its bottom. But second of all, I thought it was very interesting that he was so consumed with making sure everybody could tell a genuine article from a counterfeit. Because he understood the principle of the trademark. And what Jesus is saying here is, if you want to know how you're doing with your stewardship, do you understand that it's not just a tool, it's not just a test, but it's a trademark that can literally say to God and others, this is where my heart is in regard to you, God. And those who understand and walk in the power of seeing that it's to be used for God, they give out an entirely different message from their life. So the question I think we need to ask ourselves here is actually one that you wouldn't think. you would think that I would say, well, does my giving reflect that I'm trademarked by God? Because what happens if we're around the church a lot of times is we can say, well, I give my 10% to God, or maybe I've even grown a little bit and I'm giving 15 or 20% to God. But then with the rest of the balance, whether it's 90% or 85% or whatever, I just kind of do whatever I want. You're missing the point. Just like the people in the Old Testament missed the point, because they did all these rituals and they did all the right things and the externals on the outside, but because their hearts weren't in it, God said, away from me, this disgusts me. So I think the better question is, in regard to our trademark, not what's our giving look like, but what does our spending look like? Because what Jesus wants to drive home to us here, for the big principle, is to use our financial resources wisely. And just giving a little nod to God with 10%, but squandering the other 90%, that's not at all what Jesus is saying. So the question we need to ask ourselves here is, does my spending reflect that I live in the city of God, that I belong to Him? And if not, how can I take the next step in the right direction? You know, if you're like me, I was pretty, as some Christians would say, convicted this week as I thought about this. I kind of have known for a long time cognitively, hey, everything belongs to God. I'm just supposed to be His steward, His manager. I understand that it's a tool. I understand that it's a test. I understand now it's a trademark. Man, I'm really messed up when it comes to finances. But you know, being messed up and understanding it and owning it actually puts us in a really good place. Because it is in our spiritual bankruptcy that we are most able to accept the beneficence from God. That when we understand that we have nothing to bring to the table, and even our best efforts are tainted with sin, it's in that place that we understand how good and how awesome the grace of God is. So as you hear this message, and we begin this journey for the next 2 weeks to understand and think through what the Bible has to say about money, and you find yourself convicted in this room, you find yourself convicted in community group, understand that the gospel says for you that your financial sin, it's even more wicked than you think. But the goodness and the grace of God says that you're even more loved than you can ever understand or imagine. So what we have here is a paradox of recognizing that we don't do what we should with money, but recognizing that one has done everything for us to teach us how. He's given us the cross. He's given us a relationship with the Father through His death on our behalf. And He's given us His teaching in the Scripture to guide our lives. Maybe you're here and you've heard this today and you'd say, you know, I don't see money as any of those things. Well, can I suggest to you that the reason you don't see that is because of a deeper spiritual problem, that you're not yet rightly oriented to God, that maybe you grew up and you kind of went through some religious activities and you kind of participated in some things, maybe you even joined a church, but yet you don't really know that if you died and you stood before God, that He would let you in, not based on what you've done, but based on what Christ has done. And there's a nagging thought inside your heart that you just can't get away from, that something is not right with my soul. Today, the gospel is the answer for you as well. Today, as we take the table, you don't take it. You come and you bring the person who brought you, and we'll be in the back corner and just ask your questions and say, hey, something that you said really kind of struck a chord with me, and I really want to explore this. But for all of us to prepare ourselves to be challenged by the sake of you, let's stand to our feet and let's read the text together.